Climate Lobby, who introduced me to Jessica, helping to arrange for her meeting with us today. Thank you, George. George would like to stand. George was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps prior to retirement and has been a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby since 2014 and is on their climate security team. With George this morning is Mr. Bob Soley, another member of the Citizens Climate Lobby. If you'd stand, Bob. In 2022, Bob retired from a 43-year career as a national security analyst and executive, serving for 20 years at the Department of Defense. He's also with Rewired, Inc. and has brought information on the Inflation Reduction Act incentives for EV cars, appliances, etc. And you may take the sheet that he has for friends and family members. They have an exhibitor table right out here in Go Lobby. Following today's program with Jessica, George, Robert, and I will be at the Blue Ridge Clubhouse Education Endeavor Room, where you're invited to join us to continue the conversation on climate as a national security issue and address any other questions you may have. Although we'll have time with Jessica as well for Q&A. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Jessica Yalemo to you. Jessica is highly qualified to be our speaker this morning. She's the director of the climate security programs at the American Security Project in Washington, D.C. She lives in Virginia Beach, and that's why she's joining us this morning via Zoom. As Director of Climate Security Programs, Jessica develops and directs climate security research and provides subject matter expertise on climate security issues, including energy security, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, the domestic climate regulatory landscape, climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience for military installations, and international climate security milestones and developments. How's that for a portfolio? Jessica also facilitates collaboration and coordination between senior U.S. and foreign government officials, senior retired flag officers, and members of Congress. Jessica has written or co-authored numerous articles. She received her BA in political science with a sub-focus on international affairs at the West Virginia Wesleyan College, Buchanan, West Virginia in 2005, graduating cum laude. She received an MS in international affairs from Florida State University, Tallahassee, Florida in 2007. Jessica has been a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship awardee, spending a year in Kosovo. She also received a German Marshall Fund Award to participate as a Brussels Forum Young Professional, and she also has been a Climate and Security Advisory Group Climate Security Fellow. Her presentation will be followed by Q&A. So let's welcome Jessica to Ashby Ponds and to the Science and Faiths Forum. Thank you, Jessica. And we can turn up the sound now, and welcome to our community.
Thank you so much. Let me know if you can hear me. I hear myself. Okay, can you see the slides?
Lower.
Great.
Turn the volume down.
Lower the volume.
We can turn the volume down a bit. We can turn the volume down a bit?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Jessica, we're having problems with hearing.
I will just keep talking. Just want to say thank you to everybody for inviting me to join today. Again, I'm sorry that I cannot join you in person, but hopefully this presentation will teach you a little bit about how we think about climate change and national security. And you let me know when we're good to go.
Good to go.
Good to go.
Okay, here we go. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I've got about a half hour. I'm going to talk a little about specifically Virginia's role in national security and the climate issues that are happening here, and then go through some key federal plans and key federal actions, and then wrap it up with key takeaways and Q&A. So first and foremost, about the American Security Project. ASP, for short, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank initiated by a bipartisan group of senators, including then Senators John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, Gary Hart, and Warren Rudman. And they put this organization together to address the need for more robust dialogue about the changing nature of national security. Our mission is to educate and inform. So all of our research is done with that in mind. Our board of directors and Consensus for American Security members are a coalition of former senior government officials, retired flag officers, and business leaders who are dedicated to exploring a broad range of security issues through events, traditional and new media, meetings, and publications. Although ASP executes research in several different policy areas, climate security has been our biggest portfolio in our history, really. Since 2014, we've operated our flagship program, the National Climate Security Tour, in more than 50 events in 22 states. And that's actually where I got connected with George, was this summer at the CCL June convening. So thank you for that. In addition, ASP hosts several different other climate security related publications, including our Climate Security in Focus blog series, which explores key elements of climate security in order to facilitate a better understanding of climate policy challenges. We also, as mentioned previously, have dedicated lines of programming for maritime security and IUU fishing, electrification and electric vehicles, as well as Arctic security. So let's get into it. ASP approaches climate security research and climate challenges with a foundational understanding that climate change is an accelerant of instability. It exacerbates existing threats, risks, and hazards while converging to create new ones. Although the implications are complex, we focus our research in 7 different areas: extreme weather events and weather-related disasters, sea level rise and coastal degradation, water security, food security, public health, climate-related migration, and increased risk of violent conflict. The 2 most prominent that we deal with are the increase in extreme weather events and weather-related disasters, and sea level rise and coastal degradation. Being that I live in Virginia Beach now, those 2 are high on the list of priorities for me. These 7 areas are by no means exclusive, but rather, help, sorry, it's going on its own. They rather help frame our policy discussions. Understanding each of these issues is important on its own, but equally as important is it for us to understand how they impact each other. It's also called a threat multiplier. You'll hear that word a lot in these conversations. Since the early 2000s, the Department of Defense has conceptualized climate as a threat multiplier. And that just means it takes every existing threat and makes it worse. It doesn't necessarily stand on its own, but it does make everything much more complex. So first we'll talk about extreme weather. I'm going to go through each of these 7 areas very briefly, just so you can understand a bit more about what we're talking about. This is the latest chart from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Since 1980, there have been 363 weather and climate disasters where damages have exceeded $1 billion. The events include drought, flooding, freeze, severe storms, tropical cyclones, wildfires, and winter storms. And I will share these slides in case anybody is interested in looking closer at this, because I know it's probably kind of hard to read. But you can see that the general upward trajectory. And here is the latest that was just updated last week. As of September 11th of this year, there have been 23 confirmed weather and climate disaster events with losses that exceed $1 billion each, billion with a B. This is a new record. So you can see all the different locations of how they're classified and where they are and what type they are. And again, I will share these, but it's also available up on the NOAA website. Why is this important? A lot of these locations are where military installations are. So today I'll probably focus more on installations just because that provides sort of the easiest line of thought to follow. Another chart, and I swear this will be the last one. From 1980 to 2023, there have been 103 confirmed weather and climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion each, which have affected Virginia. This chart is just for Virginia. These events included 12 drought events, 4 flooding events, 3 freeze events, 45 severe storm events, 21 tropical cyclone events, and 18 winter storm events. And having just been through the tropical storm last weekend, I can tell you it was not a fun experience. Overall, these events have resulted in the deaths of 6,754 Virginians and have had significant economic impacts on the areas that they have occurred. Moving down the list, sea level rise and coastal degradation. Climate change essentially is a water issue. It is accelerating the warming of oceans and the melting of ice, which in turn is leading to sea level rise and coastal degradation. The impacts of sea level rise in coastal areas are compounded by erosion, storms, wetland loss, and environmental degradation from recreation and development. According to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, coastal Virginia, my home, has seen the highest rate of relative sea level rise on the whole Atlantic coast, more than 14 inches, since 1930, and is continuing to accelerate. The Hampton Roads area is particularly at risk because the land here is also sinking. Furthermore, Hampton Roads is second only to New Orleans as the largest population center at risk from sea level rise in the entire US. Sea level rise is projected to extend salinization of groundwater as well. This decreases freshwater availability for humans and ecosystems in coastal areas, as well as glacier and snow cover, reducing water availability in mountain regions that depend on the seasonal melts for water or recreation. Climate change also affects water quality as high water temperatures, floods, and droughts exacerbate water pollution. You can also see that food security is closely tied to this. Obviously, you need water for food. Food is a huge issue, especially right now with the Farm Bill, which I will not get into, but climate change is causing extreme heat, heavy and unpredictable rainfall, which is a huge issue, as well as droughts. Approximately 80% of the global population most at risk from crop failures and hunger due to climate change are in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. This means that potentially we're going to see conflicts in places where we haven't seen before, and because they're going to be fighting over scarcer and scarcer resources. There's also a risk to public health. Climate change is increasing the the rate of heart and respiratory diseases, pest diseases, and water and food related illnesses. This is a big deal. Extreme heat is the number one killer or the number one issue for climate change. This is the most impact that you're going to see. You saw it with July being the hottest month on record, closely followed by August, and this is not getting any better. So lots of unfortunate things, I guess you could say. The other concern is climate migration. Worsening weather conditions are exacerbating poverty, crime, and political instability across the globe. Over the next 30 years, approximately 140 million people are projected to migrate away from high climate risk areas. This can be either temporary or permanent, as in the case of Puerto Ricans after Hurricane Maria. There's a large immigration from Puerto Rico to Central Florida that's created a housing shortage. Some of those are there permanently, some of them are there temporarily. But even if it's temporary, it still creates lots of issues. There's also an increased risk of violent conflict. Climate change is, as we defined earlier, a threat multiplier and a destabilizer. This allows for terrorist groups to use climate vulnerabilities as a recruiting tool, especially in Africa. Climate security is national security, and that's at the core of our work. We believe it is directly impacting our national security, as does the U.S. intelligence community and the Department of Defense. It is already exacerbating existing threats, risks, and hazards while simultaneously creating new ones. It's impacting infrastructure, hurting our economy, and undermining the security and well being of our fellow Americans. From energy and food security to our military readiness and economic competitiveness, no industry or individual is unaffected by climate change. As mentioned previously, the conversation today will focus mostly on how climate change is impacting the US military, and installations in particular. From our installation communities at home to the shores of our partners and allies abroad, climate is changing the very nature of how, when, and where militaries train and operate. We are already seeing how climate is impacting the US military in three main ways: readiness, operations, and missions. At a recent event at West Point, Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks put it succinctly: "You can't train for combined operations with allies and partners if the training facilities are flooded. You can't run an installation without water because you're in a drought, and you can't adequately prepare for future threats if you're occupied with urgent crises." Responding to climate crises are already impacting manpower and readiness. For example, the number of personnel days the National Guard spent on firefighting increased from 14,000 in fiscal year 2016 to 176,000 days in fiscal year 2021. That's more than a 12-fold increase in 5 years, which has required the redirection of time, attention, and resources. So let's explore some of these issues more in depth: readiness, operations, and missions. Broadly speaking, these are the three areas that can help clarify specifically how climate is impacting the military and our national security. A 2019 Department of Defense climate report highlighted climate as a primary operational and readiness concern for 79 installations and classified them as at risk for severe climate impacts. Climate directly impacts readiness in several ways, but essentially it means that military forces may not be able to execute their missions on time and at full capacity. Specifically, climate-induced increases in black flag days, or days where the temperature reaches 90 degrees or higher, impacts the ability of soldiers to maintain a proficiency, train, and exercise the skills needed to achieve mission success. According to official DoD statistics, the rates of heat stroke among military personnel stationed in the US nearly doubled between 2014 and 2019. The military spent $1 billion with a B on extreme heat-related injuries between 2008 and 2019. Similarly, the impacts from extreme weather, like smoke from wildfires or storm surge from hurricanes, can either delay or destroy training infrastructure altogether. Additionally, climate is impacting where and how the military operates. For example, the US military, along with other Arctic nations, are paying close attention to melting permafrost and glaciers that have the potential to open up new areas for operations in the Arctic. The opening of the Arctic may require additional resources, like more icebreakers, as well as different types of equipment and training environments. According to the 2014 DoD Climate Roadmap, sea level rise could impact the execution of amphibious landings, changing temperatures and lengthening seasons could impact operational timing windows, and increased frequency of extreme weather could impact overflight and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. Consequently, this could impact how we understand our adversaries' capabilities and movements. Likewise, climate change is increasing the number of extreme weather and severe weather events, like typhoons and drought, resulting in increased humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations abroad, and more frequent defense support of civil authorities' missions at home. It may cause instability in other countries by impairing access to food and water, spreading disease, exacerbating existing social tensions, and fueling mass migration. Climate change is subsequently likely to increase the operational tempo, or tempo, of military personnel and resources. For example, Aircraft, vehicles, and other material resources require routine maintenance after so many uses. Similarly, pilots watch commanders require so many hours of rest before they can go back to work. An increased op-tempo has severe impacts on this. Climate change is likely to complicate already tight schedules and increase op-tempo even further. Now a bit more about Virginia's specific role in national security. Based on 2022 statistics, Virginia ranks second, only behind California, for the number of total military personnel in the state. I'm not sure if you can see this breakdown, but these are some pretty big numbers. So anything that happens within the Department of Defense has a significant impact on Virginia's role in national security, as well as the Virginia economy. Virginia has 27 military bases. Every service branch has at least one base in Virginia. DoD in Northern Virginia alone has a projected economic impact which exceeds $54 billion. Recurrent flooding, drought, desertification, and wildfires are all key climate-related threats and risks for these military installations. The Greater Hampton Roads area is one of the most vulnerable operational military installation communities in the United States. We're facing sea level rise at nearly twice the global average, and Naval Station Norfolk already faces sunny day flooding, which is where even on a casual raining day, it can flood. A little closer to you, Fort Belvoir in Fairfax also suffers from flooding risks. That has a direct impact on a number of missions. In 2019, as I mentioned, the DoD report to Congress listed 79 installations that were most at risk for impacts of climate change. Both Fort Belvoir and Joint Base Langley Eustis were both listed. Joint Base Langley Eustis in the Greater Hampton Roads area is expected to see a sea level rise between 4.5 and 6.9 feet by the end of the century. Absent additional mitigation and adaptation measures, this means that the installations can expect more and frequent and extensive tidal flooding, loss of land, and severe weather impacts. What does this mean for the military? Well, Joint Base Langley Eustis is home to Air Combat Command, Air Force Materiel Command, Air Force Reserve Command, Air National Guard, U.S. Army Forces Command, Army Training and Doctor Command, and I can go on and on. It has severe impacts when that base is flooded. Similarly, Fort Belvoir in Fairfax County. Fort Belvoir is home to nearly 51,000 employees. That's twice as many workers as the Pentagon and is the largest employer in Fairfax County. It serves as the headquarters or operating base, for 17 different DoD entities. So what happens here has huge impacts on many different facets of the DoD enterprise. So now for the positive things. The doom and gloom is out of the way. This is a brief snapshot of some of the climate-specific strategies and plans that the Department of Defense enterprise has developed over the past 20 years. As you can see, some of these have been around for a decade or more, which demonstrates that this is not just a passing fad. This is an important institutional issue. DoD has been conceptualizing climate as a national security issue since at least 2007. A landmark report from the Center for Naval Analysis in 2007 really launched climate change into the national security conversation. And a few years later, policymakers solidified climate change as a national security threat in the 2010 and 2014 Quadrennial Defense Reviews. That's the precursor to the National Defense Strategy. Over the past 5 years, DoD and each of the service branches have issued additional climate-related strategies and plans designed to institutionalize climate as a strategic, operational, and tactical concern. DoD now includes security implications of climate change in all risk analysis, strategy development, and planning. Following the Biden administration's issuance of Executive Order 14008, Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, and Executive Order 14057, Catalyzing Clean Energy Industries and Jobs Through Federal Sustainability, more than 20 federal agencies released climate plans, including the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the Department of Defense. Each service branch, including the Coast Guard, has a climate plan. In addition, DoD has updated the Unified Facilities Criteria, which guides installation building codes to incorporate climate change-related risks into installation master planning. All of this demonstrates the importance of climate security as an element of national security. So what's in these plans? I don't want to get too into the weeds today, but I would like to give you just a little bit more insight into the plans. The DoD enterprise is approaching its climate efforts in two main ways: adaptation to enhance resilience, and mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Many of Big DoD's milestones are continuous actions, like educating the workforce. The metrics and measures are still being worked out. But they did release a 2022 progress report if you're interested in knowing more on that process. Given our limited time today, I won't deep dive into all of the plans, but will touch briefly on the Army's plan, since it's the only strategy that also has an implementation plan. The Army Climate Strategy outlines plans to pursue three major goals to reach its desired end states: achieving a 50% reduction in Army net greenhouse gas pollution by 2030, attaining net zero Army greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, proactively considering the security implications of climate change in strategy, planning, acquisition, supply chain, and programming documents and processes. The Army has already decreased overall installation greenhouse gas emissions by 20% since 2008 and remains committed to 100% carbon pollution-free electricity in order to meet the needs of its installations by 2030. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions is a priority for the entire enterprise, not simply because it helps the U.S. achieve its strategic climate goals, but because it's also a smart operational and tactical decision. DoD has the second largest federal vehicle fleet and already has been transitioning tactical vehicles to hybrids and moving non-tactical cars and trucks on bases straight to electric. This is important. Less fuel dependence means less fuel convoys and less casualties. The military spent approximately $81 billion annually on protecting oil infrastructure, and resupply can cost somewhere about 4 lives for every 100 convoys in a combat theater. Deputy Secretary of Defense Dr. Kathleen Hicks put it succinctly during a recent speech. Electric vehicles are quiet, they have a low heat signature and incredible torque. And because they tend to be low maintenance with fewer moving parts, they have the potential to reduce logistics requirements, all of which helps give our troops an edge on the battlefield. Increased electrification can therefore help our military be more secure by reducing dependence on foreign oil and gas and reduce financial incentives of petrostates. More good stuff. These are some of the highlights of some of the ongoing programs that the DoD is sponsoring. Military installations contribute approximately $12 billion annually, lots of billion dollars going around, to local economies. So enhancing climate resilience is a key priority for defense communities, not only for national security, but also for economic reasons. There are several federal climate mitigation and resilience building programs that demonstrate the importance of integrating climate risks into military planning and national security. These are only a few highlights that demonstrate the importance of integrating climate considerations and conceptualizing climate as a national security issue. The Defense Community Infrastructure Program, specifically, is designed to address deficiencies not just at military installations, but in the surrounding community infrastructure that supports the installation in order to enhance the value, increase resilience, and improve military family quality of life. This year, 2 Virginia locations were selected for grant funding: Naval Station Norfolk and Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek, Fort Story. The project at Naval Station Norfolk is for the construction of stormwater management system improvements on a main access road to the base, which will reduce flooding constraints to allow better military and civilian personnel access. The project at Little Creek will replace deteriorated infrastructure at the Creed's Law Enforcement Training Facility, enabling a modern training environment for civilian and military policy and Navy forces, which will therefore enhance operational readiness, training efficiency, and the ability to accommodate total force requirements. DoD's Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation also issues grants for military installation resilience reviews. In 2022, the Northern Virginia Regional Commission was awarded a MERT grant to study the impacts of current and future climate hazards on 4 Nova counties and 3 military installations: Joint Base Meyer Henderson Hall, U.S. Army Garrison Fort Belvoir, Marine Corps Base Quantico, and Arlington, Fairfax, Prince William, and Stafford counties. The final report, issued in June of this year, lists 129 strategies that go beyond climate hazards to address issues related to emergency management, regional connectivity, and access to resources. The strategies aim to break down silos and improve coordination and information sharing between installations and the counties for efforts to combat climate change. The Northern Virginia Regional Commission was awarded a subsequent second MERT grant to build upon the actions and milestones outcomes in the first grant. If you'd like to read that, you can find it online, or you can shoot me an email and I will send it to you. Other good news story, the Sentinel Landscapes Partnership. The Sentinel Landscapes Partnership is a coalition of federal agencies, state and local governments, and non-governmental organizations that work with private landowners to advance sustainable land management practices around military installations and ranges. DoD, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Interior partner to strengthen military readiness, conserve natural resources, bolster agriculture and forestry economies, and increase climate change resilience. Since 2012, over $197 million in Department of Defense funds, as well as millions of dollars from USDA and the Department of Interior, have supported projects across 10 Sentinel landscapes. These contributions have permanently protected over 610,000 acres of land within Sentinel landscapes and enrolled an additional 3.1 million acres of land in technical assistance programs. In July, DoD announced the Virginia Security Corridor as the newest Sentinel landscape. And here is a map of that. Hopefully you can see yourself on this map. The Virginia Security Corridor is comprised of actually 2 Sentinel landscapes, the Potomac and the Tidewater. This region as a whole encompasses over 2.9 million acres of land and water in Virginia's Golden Crescent, an area of high military concentration, population growth, urban sprawl, and a growing technological industry. It's also home to some of the Commonwealth's most abundant resources, including intact forests, open and agricultural lands, and complex marsh and riverine systems that connect to the nation's largest estuary, the Chesapeake Bay. The Virginia Security Corridor supports 10 military installations representing every branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. Specifically, the Potomac Sentinel landscape is anchored by Marine Corps Base Quantico, and the Tidewater Sentinel landscape is anchored by Joint Base Langley Eustis. Partners established the Virginia Security Corridor to address 3 lines of effort. 1, preventing encroachment on military testing and training activities while supporting Virginia's working lands. 2, building resilience against climate-induced hazards. And 3, conserving and restoring key habitats to benefit water quality and protect species. These Sentinel landscapes will also provide a connection between the Middle Chesapeake and Eastern North Carolina Sentinel landscapes, enabling coordination of opportunities at a more regional scale. With that, I am just about out of time, so I want to leave you with a few key takeaways. First is that Virginia is home to some very important military assets and which directly support our national security. Things that happen here truly matter. Climate change is already impacting the soldiers, sailors, and airmen that call Virginia home, as well as the installations where they live and work with their families. The other thing I want to emphasize is that DoD has been working to adapt to climate change and enhance resilience and mitigate its greenhouse gas emissions for more than 10 years. This is not a new thing. Plans have been in the works for some time, and they're continuing to make progress. If you're interested in knowing more, please visit us at americansecurityproject.org, or feel free to email us. And pending any questions, that concludes this briefing.
Thank you, Jessica, for that wonderful program. Very informative, and we will now have time for questions and answers. While our people are getting microphones to those who want to ask a question, I'll start. And I was wanting to ask you about Loudoun County's data centers. We all live in Loudoun County, and in fact, we have Data Center Alley across the road from us. Loudoun County has over 110 data centers, far more than any other county in Virginia. So, in terms of that fact that 70% of global internet goes through Loudoun County, how does that pertain to our national security? And what might we need to be aware of? We're very concerned about the amount of electrical power they use, as well as water. And do you have that in your radar?
I don't. I'm not familiar with the data centers. I am loosely familiar with critical infrastructure. So given that 70% of the global internet does come through there, I would say that that's probably on the radar of the Department of Homeland Security. It's not something that we particularly look at ASP, but certainly that would be of critical importance for the Department of Homeland Security and its Office of Critical Infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. Who has our first question for Jessica? Right there.
Hi, this is a very good presentation. I did some research last night on the Army climate change initiatives, and I thought, if it's done right, it can really increase readiness, like in the use of hybrid vehicles, greater efficiency, and so forth. But two comments. One of the big issues that they discussed was how you generate the electricity as you move to more electricity. They talk about modular atomic reactors, that kind of thing. The second issue was your charts on the impact of extreme weather events and the cost. Your parameter was billions of dollars over a long period of time. Does your chart take into account inflation and the fact that people are building, there's construction, residential in particular, in low-lying areas and floodplain areas and so forth? Are those two factors accounted for in those charts on the cost of extreme weather events?
Yes, and to be clear, they're not my charts. I want to give proper attribution, but the charts that I used from NOAA do account for inflation. And I can dig into the weeds a little bit more about how those are calculated and get back to you. I can send them to Reverend Wright. But to your point about sort of tying the first question and this question together, there is a push, especially within the Army. They have a stated goal of installing a microgrid at every installation by 2035. So there's a huge push for microgrids, but those still have to be plugged into a grid. So the permitting discussion and the regulatory discussion around that is apropos. It's a huge issue. I know that there's some discussion on the Hill with reforming that process, but doing so in a way that expedites. I know that the debt ceiling deal last year expedited some of that timeline. But we need to make sure that the environmental regulations are also accounted for. And that's something that the Army is certainly thinking about. If you look at something, it's not Army, but Marine Corps Air Station Miramar out in California actually has a microgrid that works pretty seamlessly with the power grid out there. And they have actually supplied power to the greater California region around the base several times. So they use part of the landfill out there. It's super interesting. I wish I had my slides handy for that. But the short version is that the base operates in such a way now that it's a net zero base and that they can actually provide power to the community. So not only are they more resilient, so when the power goes down, they go up. They actually supplied power to about, I think, 600,000 people. So those homes, those residences didn't have to deal with blackouts or brownouts. So there's some really interesting potential for microgrids, but obviously you need the personnel to manage them. You need the designs, and those things take 10 plus years. So one of our areas of focus for our research is actually looking about what are the parameters that need to be expedited in order to achieve those stated goals that specifically the Army has. There's also a big difference between doing things domestically and non-tactically than doing them in a kinetic environment. So if you're in a combat zone, transitioning to EVs is a department-wide emphasis. So the entire Department of Defense is trying to transition both non-tactical and tactical vehicles to electric vehicles. Obviously, it's not possible right now to do it in a tactical environment. So if you're, in a desert in Iraq, how are you going to charge a vehicle? But there is a ton of research going on in that space. I can't really go into specifics right now, but there's some cool stuff on the Bradley fighting vehicle that can either transition to hybrid or fully electric in a kinetic environment that are showing some promise. And both DARPA and the Defense Innovation Unit are working on that. So again, if you take nothing away from this presentation, there are a lot of really cool things, a lot of really interesting technologies taking place that are going to really give us an edge on the battlefield, as well as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you very much for your fine presentation. I want to turn your attention to the West Coast. I've read several times that we are facing a harsh winter. So my question may be too much in the nitty-gritty, but I definitely think it is a security question. How many icebreakers do we have off Alaska? And what do we do if at any given time of the few that we do have, which is what I surmise, if one or two are in dry dock to be repaired, from whom do we borrow another one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that the Coast Guard has been screaming about for a really long time. Interestingly, Coast Guard is funded through the Department of Homeland Security, vice the Department of Defense. I think, please don't quote me on this, I hesitate to even give you a number, but I think we have 4 icebreakers right now. So the Navy, I believe, is experimenting with taking some of its ships farther north. Joint Base Elmendorf Richardson up in Alaska is watching this very closely. The Port of Nome up in Alaska has been granted funds from the federal government to build a deep water port so it can host aircraft carriers if need be. This is really, even if we wanted to fund it today, right? Like, so say we got, $20 billion or whatever it is to fund building more cutters for the Coast Guard or icebreakers, it would still take some time to do. And this is really where we leverage our partnerships, our international partnerships. So particularly with the Nordic states, Norway has been an excellent partner. Finland now has joined NATO. So that's where really those partnerships and those international agreements come into play. Canada as well. They've got resources, and Sweden, although not a NATO member, Sweden has been a staunch supporter of NATO and has been a huge defense partner for the U.S. So in lieu of us having those resources of our own, we do have partners that we can leverage. But that gets into a very interesting discussion about the law of the sea, and especially now that China has declared itself, self-declared, an Arctic state, even though they have no Arctic coastline. And Russia obviously has been expelled from the Arctic Council. So given Russia's war in Ukraine, it's created a lot of interesting dynamics in the Arctic that is becoming increasingly an area of interest. Great question.
I got a question about electrifying military vehicles. Have you identified specific vehicles that are good candidates for electrification?
Non-tactical vehicles, so those are the vehicles that you just drive around bases, right? Those are fairly straightforward. Those are regular commercial off-the-shelf vehicles that you can electrify. You, of course, need the infrastructure to support that, right? So what good is an EV if you don't have a place to charge it? So I think domestically, the bigger issue there is making sure that you have the infrastructure to support it. You're obviously seeing some elements of the EV discussion with the UAW strike right now. I did catch President Trump's unfortunate comments last night. I don't necessarily agree with those, but I do think that the EV transition will be disruptive, obviously, for the automobile industry. So building out that EV infrastructure, not just at the base, but in the communities, and that's something that the previous legislation in the IIJA and some of the executive orders and the Inflation Reduction Act have provided some of those funds, and it's now up to the states to figure out how and when and what they want that to look like. In terms of tactical vehicles, it's very tricky. I was just on the phone with someone who was from the Army Rapid Capabilities Office. They've been doing some field demonstration for the Bradley fighting vehicle. So I know that that's been a topic of discussion. There was one other that he mentioned that I can't remember the name, but the Bradley is being actually tested in the field now. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes. Hi there. When we talk about national security, I immediately think of China, and you just mentioned that. China is my biggest fear right now, and I'm really concerned that we're taking, and I shouldn't say we're taking because I don't know, are we taking our eye off the ball? And are we diverting a lot of our resources, to trying to, decrease gases and whatever? And it's my understanding that for it to be of any significance, it has to be an international project anyway. I mean, if it's really going to work. So if you have China, who is my understanding, they're not really cooperating. They're creating coal plants. And so if you just want to look at one subject matter of manufacturing, they're on the move. They are manufacturing. They're building up their military. I don't think they're worried about greenhouse gases. It's more important that they get ready, and a lot of people feel they are looking to invade the United States at some point. I'm sure you've thought about all this. What about that? What about, not that we can't do two things at the same time, but I don't think China is going to wait, and a lot of our things, you said everything's in research down the line. What if we're invaded? What if within the next 5 years something happens?
That's a great question. And the concerns about China are omnipresent in everything that's being done. The National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy both call out China and Russia specifically as our number one sort of pacing threat, is what they call it. There's also a very valid line of concern about the clean energy transition, because China does currently dominate the critical minerals extraction and refining industry. So the battery parts that you need for EVs, the solar panels that you use to put on your house or your business, those are manufactured in China. And I'm going to steal a phrase from Richard Kidd, who was just with us on a different event. He's the former Deputy Secretary of Defense for Energy and Installations. So this is really a choice that we have here. We can either continue to cede the ground to China, who already dominates it, or we have to get in the ring and find a way. And I think that's what you're seeing. Again, we're a nonpartisan organization, but I think that's what you're seeing in the intent behind a lot of the current administration's actions, is to try to develop a whole new market. So there was just a lithium deposit found out in the West. I think it's between Nevada, on the border of Nevada, I believe. Don't quote me on that. But developing our own critical mineral industry, developing that innovation, that's really where America can lead, because the technologies and the industries for the clean energy transition that China currently dominates, those are all U.S. innovations. We just failed to really seize the opportunity to do something about it, and to really cultivate an industry there. So the current administration has done a lot of things. Congress has also done a lot of things. That's why you see the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. All of that is designed to really spur the development of that industry in the domestic United States. So they're looking at everything from the supply chain to how things are extracted to workers' wages. And I know that there's obviously a lot of concern with that. But I think it's a very important point. It's omnipresent. There are a lot of people who are much, much smarter than me thinking about it and working on that. But I believe the current thinking with the current administration is that if we can get this off the ground through these pieces of legislation and really, hit the ground running with this stuff, we can compete with China.
Any other questions for Jessica? Jessica, I have one, and this will be our last question. You mentioned climate refugees and how that can be a threat multiplier to the military, as well as the incentives, in a sense, that it might give for terrorist groups in Africa. And so in terms of our national security, how do you see the climate refugees and the terrorist groups or young people who may be more readily available for recruitment into terrorist groups? How do you see that playing out vis-a-vis our military and how we respond to climate change?
That's a great question. So I'll first start with a little closer to home, and that's immigration from the Northern Triangle. So Guatemala, Ecuador, coming up through Mexico, you can see, these what are already essentially failed states. So you have governments who don't function or cannot provide routine services to its citizens. So you see people getting increasingly frustrated and have given up hope. And so you're seeing more of that anyway. So you have a place that, like Haiti, that suffers a massive earthquake or gets hit by a big typhoon or a hurricane and can't recover and can't provide basic services. So the people think, okay, I've got to leave. It creates a void. And much like any American, if you're not getting what you want, you try to do something to change it. You want the best for your family. You want the best for your children. I think militarily is something that the military is watching very closely. They're watching, the military is structured in different ways. So you have different geographic combatant commands. So you've got, a European command that focuses on European issues. They're very busy right now with Ukraine, but they're also still watching migration coming up through the Mediterranean from Northern Africa. So they do annual threat assessments, and they're watching, not pinpointing that climate change is the issue, but like I said, it's the threat multiplier. So these issues exist outside of climate change, but climate change makes them much worse. So the increase in extreme weather, if there's more extreme weather, then it's more likely that you see a situation like you had in Libya, where the dams break, infrastructure can't hold, and you have widespread deaths. And so, people lose hope and they decide to move. Or you have a place like Bangladesh that is sinking and suffering. And those people are going to move. So it's something that, between the intelligence officials and military folks who are doing either security cooperation programs, USAID folks that are on the ground, this is really the whole of government approach to this. And that's why you've seen almost every federal government agency come up with a climate plan, because one of the most terrifying things about climate change is that it's going to impact everything everywhere, and it's just figuring out, okay, what exactly, or how can we approach and parse the issues in a way to try to improve it. So specifically, what do I think is going to happen? I don't know. I have found IUU fishing to be a particularly interesting area of interest, because as ocean waters are warming, fish stocks are moving northward. So a remarkable amount of the world's population relies on fishing. And back to China, China operates a 17,000 ship distant water fishing fleet. So you see Chinese ships that will go dark and are untraceable outside of like the Galapagos, or outside of an exclusive economic zone for countries. So there's a lot happening there, and all of these things are sort of intrinsically tied to each other. So I think the most important thing is to just be aware and continue to follow it. And then two is to make your voices heard. So, communicate your concerns to your elected officials, and we'll do the best we can. But I have no doubt that the U.S. Is up to the challenge.
Thank you. And if there are no other questions, thank you so much, Jessica, for being with us. You have given us a lot more to think about, particularly our Friends Acting for Climate Today group, and we will share what you have shared with us. It's also being recorded and will be shown on our Ashby Ponds TV channel. So more people will hear what you have shared
Thank
with
you.
us today. So thank you very much. And let's show Jessica.
Thank you. Have a great day.
And I want to remind you of the October 12th meeting for Science and Faiths Forum at 11 a.m. right here in Go Theater. The speaker will be Stephen Himmler, president of Catholic Apologetics Institute of North America, and he will be discussing near-death experiences. The title of his talk is Evidence of the Soul. So I think that might be something we're all interested in, and look forward to seeing you again here for that October 12th program. Also, I want to remind you that George and Bob and I will again be over at the Blue Ridge Endeavor Education Room, so you're invited to come over and join us and continue in the conversation for about a half hour or so. Thank you all for being here today. It's great to have you, and spread the word. We're all acting together. Have a good afternoon.